Welcome to our virtual program for Indigenous Peoples Day. We are so excited to use this time to learn and talk together. And I encourage all of you to share your questions, your thoughts, your ideas in our moderated chat box. I won't be able to see or hear any viewers on this call, but I would love for all of you to be part of the conversation by way of the chat. And as we get started, I was wondering if we might consider together what is Indigenous Peoples Day and what does Indigenous mean? Let's start with the day. What is Indigenous Peoples Day? Any ideas? What do you think? Do you think is there anything it makes you think of, even if you don't know exactly what it is? What is Indigenous Peoples Day? You're welcome to answer in the chat. Oh, it celebrates, that's a great answer. It celebrates Native Americans. I love that. Oh, we have one of our users who knows what it means to be Native. That's perfect. We'll talk about that in just a minute. It's to celebrate Native people. I love this. Yeah. So, maybe celebrating ancestors. So Indigenous Peoples Day honors the history and the culture of the many different Native American nations whose land we all live on. That is if you're watching from the US. I guess I'm assuming that you are. I'd love if you could, if there's maybe a window or a door nearby, I'd love for you to take a moment to look outside at the land that you live on, or to look around where I am. I'm here at the Museum of Life and Science. I'm actually in a little conference room in the Butterfly House, so I'm looking out onto the Butterfly House steps. And this is a place where I work and where many of you come to learn and to play. This land was here before we were born, and it'll be here after us too. Many of our ancestors may have lived here, and many of our one-day children may live here as well. This program is about honoring Indigenous peoples' history and imagining a future that honors Indigenous people who still live here. I think this future will be brighter for everyone in our communities too. We're going to have some really interesting conversations today, and I hope if there are any times when you don't know what to say, you can just look outside at the land around you or at the land around me and think about what it means to be part of this greater whole together. Oh, it's so cool that's so cool to see when you see where you all are viewing from. That's so awesome. All right, so we have been using the word Indigenous, right, to talk about, and I think it sounds like we have some people who know what Indigenous means. What do we think? Sounds like maybe it has to do with being from somewhere. What do you think? What does it mean to be Indigenous? Or I saw someone using a synonym or a word with a similar meaning, Native. What does it mean? What do you think? Right? Being Indigenous means to be Native. It kind of means to be from wherever we're talking about. It means to be from a particular place, but more than that, it means originating from a particular place. We consider a person to be Indigenous to a place if they or their ancestors were the very first people to come to that place. And I saw a really good addition in the chat. Someone said that Indigenous Peoples Day is another holiday because people didn't want to celebrate Christopher Columbus anymore. And I love that. That's a great addition, right? We celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day on this day instead of celebrating Columbus Day because Indigenous people were here first, the very first, the original people. That's a great addition to be here. You can't really discover a place that people already live in, right? Indigenous people discovered America tens of thousands of years before any other people, right? There's a kind of a more recent discovery in a cave in Mexico that shows us that Indigenous people have been living here for at least 30,000 years. That's a long time. That is a very, very long time. We celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day because I think a lot of us grew up learning a different story about how America was colonized, how European people came to America. The real account is unfortunately not a super happy story. I don't know if any of you know anything about it, but if you'd like to share anything with me that you know in the chat, I'd love to hear it. When the European explorer Christopher Columbus and other European colonists came to the Americas, they brought a lot of diseases with them that people who already lived in the Americas had never encountered before. They also brought violence that killed millions of the indigenous people that were already living here. When the European colonies came together and America declared itself a free country, it did so by taking freedom away from certain people, like enslaved African people, and from Native American nations, and drove indigenous people away from their own land. I wanted to kind of share just like a map with you about how indigenous people and indigenous land kind of disappeared over time, or the land itself didn't disappear, but indigenous people were driven away from it. So what I'm going to do is I just want to quickly share my screen. And I just wanted to show you this GIF here. So it kind of starts in kind of the 1800s, and you can see how that blue, which shows Native American homelands, starts to disappear over time. You can see down at the bottom, you have the year. You can see bits of red popping up. That's where some Native nations, Native people were relocated to, different reservations, but you can see even that these Native American reservations got smaller. So the trend over time is less and less and less and less land for the people who are originally from this land. I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen, bring it back to me here. And this is a really good addition in the chat. We have someone saying that Christopher Columbus, and indeed, right, many of European colonizers weren't necessarily very nice to indigenous people. That's a way to put it for sure. We have, yeah, that a lot of these settlers are driving Native Americans away, and we're gonna talk about why too. And I just wanted to say, someone in the chat mentioned and wanted to know if Occaneechi and Eno are indigenous names, and you're exactly right. Occaneechi and Eno are both names of indigenous nations, indigenous groups. So that's a great addition. We're gonna be talking about them more today. I love it. That's a great addition. Lots of natives got sick from the settlers. So even if you didn't have, even in the cases where you didn't have people, settlers actively driving away Native Americans, you had them getting sick. And we actually are going to be talking about one of the reasons why sickness was so prevalent when the first Europeans came to this area, to the Carolinas. So the cool thing about this, and maybe the sort of happy next chapter of this story, is that even after centuries of forced migration, of violence, of languages and traditions being lost to the American government's efforts to erase indigenous people's cultures, indigenous people are not gone. They're not just a part of history. Indigenous people live now, live here, and live many places on this continent. So that makes it even more important to honor this day for indigenous people now. So one thing we are going to do today on Indigenous Peoples Day is acknowledge the land we live on. So what does it mean to acknowledge something? What do you think? If we're going to be acknowledging the land we live on, what do you think? What do you think that means? Oh, to appreciate, that's a good way to think about it. If we're acknowledging it, we are definitely taking it into our brains. We're thinking a lot about it. We're admitting that in a way, right, it exists in a certain way. We are, we're kind of letting people know that we know about this land, right? To acknowledge it is, oh, I love this, to be a good steward of the land, to take care of it. We're accepting it, we're observing it. So if we're going to acknowledge the land we live on, in this way, in this program, it's going to be about kind of declaring that we know whose land it originally is. Now, I don't own any land, so I cannot legally give it back to anybody, right? But what I can do is I can, and what we all can do is that we can learn about what lands we're living on. Knowing and saying whose land I am standing on is the first step to learning more about the past and the present. So the more we know, the more we can do to make the world better for everyone who lives in it. So I would love it if you might all consider doing your own land acknowledgement with me today. Before we get started with our map, because we're going to be talking about maps a lot today, I was thinking, let's think more about this land that we live on. Would you all be willing to describe to me the land that you live on? And that's not just necessarily the structure you live in, but the place where your home is or the land around it. What do you see when you look out a window? What do you think? Oh, thank you so much for sharing. We have someone who's saying that their tribe is in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. So this is the tribe of Chippewa or Ojibwe Native Americans who are called the Great Lakes, who are called Great Lakes tribes. So they also owned those waters. That's so wonderful. It says that this person's great-grandfather still owns 400 acres of sugar maple trees and that he makes maple syrup. I love that. If you happen to have any link to where I could get any of that maple syrup, let me know. So if we're thinking about the land around us, we're having some people saying lots of trees. Oh, and you have deer in your yard? That's awesome. Oh, some of you live close to the Eno River? That's wonderful. We see trees and grass. Piper sees some roads and grass, birds. Oh, creeks, more deer. That is so cool, living in Duke Forest. Oh, you have a pond near your house. If I'm looking just out here, I see lots of different trees. I see grass as well. I see kind of some hills. Ooh, in your yard, you have a fox with fox kids. That's awesome. It sounds like we're really aware of this natural world that's all around us. So I'm excited to learn about kind of a different layer of this land. So I know that when I think about where I live, if I wanted to kind of let someone know where I lived, I might be able to tell them about the land that I live on in terms of, yeah, there's grass, there's trees, there's cool stuff. But if I wanted them to find me where I was, I'd probably give someone my address, right? I might use a map. I might use streets. I might describe different landmarks. You know, like, oh, it's just a couple blocks from the Museum of Life and Science, that kind of thing. And I don't know about you all, but I actually really love maps. They can be really helpful. And I think that we are going to take a look at our own maps. I wanted to use a map that I attached that you all could print out if you wanted to. You can also use any other map, or you can print out a map later to use. That would also be totally fine. I would love it if you might do our map drawing exercise with us. If you want to do it on your own time, that's also totally fine, and just kind of watch what we see. So I've got my map here, and this is a map that I got from a website called nativeland.ca. It's a Canadian website, so it has a .ca. And when I tried to log into it this morning, or when I tried to go to it this morning, there was a really wonderful problem with it, and that is it crashed because the server was busy. That means that there were so many people who were trying to log on to this website that the site wasn't able to handle it. So we're not able to use the site if we just go to the website for right now. It'll probably be back up later. But you can use the app, and that's available for free in the Google Play Store and the App Store. I have it here on an iPad that I'm going to use. I'm not going to be able to share my screen, but I will show you what I'm seeing on my screen. So I've got my map of Durham that I got originally from nativeland.ca. I printed it out. And it's a really cool, this site is a really cool resource that can get us started learning about the land we live on. And I was hoping we could use it to reimagine this land in a way that honors Indigenous people of the past and the present. So I wanted to kind of show it to you a little bit here. I'm going to switch to a different camera, and I'll actually put that in the chat. It is, oops, nativeland.ca. So again, the site right now is down. You could always check it out later, but the app is working. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my camera so that you can see my iPad a little bit better. Oops. Let's try plugging it in. There we go. So now I have got you kind of have a bird's eye view of my screen here. So even if you're not using yours, you can see what mine looks like. And it brings us out to this place right here. It shows us kind of the whole of North America here. And there's a little bar that lets you put in your address or the address of anything. You can just put in Durham. I know that what I put in was 433 West Murray Avenue, which is in Durham, North Carolina. That's the address of the Museum of Life and Science. And when I do that and I hit enter, it takes me to this area, and the app doesn't show all of the different nations at once, but it does show them if you click on different areas. So if I click there, I can see a whole different nation. If I click here, I can see a few more. When I just click on the address of the museum, and it brings me to this little pin that's right here, it shows me that it is on Shakori land. So if I wanted to acknowledge that, I think I'm gonna kind of give something that's informal, but it's important to know and to say, and you don't have to say it, but I know that I'm gonna say it just because I feel like it's important. And you're welcome to do this on your own if you're looking at where you live. But I think I'll say, because I know now, I acknowledge that I am on Shakori land right now. By saying this, I commit to learning more about the history, ongoing challenges, and cultural celebrations of this Indigenous nation. So that's what I think I'm going to say about, that's my land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that I'm right here in the Museum of Life and Science on Shakori land. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my map right here, my map that I printed out, and I want to color over it. I want to look at some of these different nations that I see when I'm clicking around, and I want to draw kind of where they are. So I'm going to move this aside for just a moment, because I'm going to start drawing. And if yours looks like mine, that's awesome. And if it looks a little bit different, that's okay too. Because these boundaries that we're seeing aren't, they're not as cut and dry as a state boundary is, right? These are kind of approximate, based on different historical accounts, based on personal accounts. So I'm going to do my best, but it doesn't have to be super exact. I think I'm going to be looking at, I know the Museum of Life and Science is right about here. There we go. That's my site, the Museum of Life and Science. And I know when I look that the Shakori area of land is really large. So I think it comes kind of just before this area right here. Comes right before this Falls Lake area is how close it goes. So I'm going to have it go about like this, and then it kind of goes back like this, right under where Chapel Hill is. And I'm going to label it using my red as well, Shakori. And I think I want to do another one too, because I saw some different nations when I was clicking around. Let's go ahead and I want to kind of click over here, because where I live is actually a little bit south of Durham. So I'm going to click over here. Whoa. And I see this really large Tuscarora area. It's also called the Scarora area. I'm going to use some orange to do that. That's really large. I see that it kind of goes through Falls Lake here. And it kind of goes through, it appears at least, to go through some areas that the Shakori territory also was. So that's really interesting. And that might tell us a little bit about the history of this area, which we'll also talk about a little bit later. Tuscarora, wonderful. Oh, this is a really, really cool addition. And thank you to Sydney for sharing this. There's a nonprofit that honors our native Shakori land in Chatham County, as well as the arts, music, and dance from around the world through its various festivals. Oh yes, Shakori Hills is such a wonderful website that I was visiting earlier as well. There's a bunch of really cool, I know that they have hosted powwows in the past, and I hope they will host powwows in the future. That is so wonderful. I would love to put that in the chat. Shakori Hills, thank you for sharing that with us, Sydney. Let's see if I can maybe add one or two other nations so I can get a more complete picture. What if I click a little bit, so that shows me perfect, that shows me Shakori again. What if I click kind of over here? Here we go, let's try over here. Ooh, I see a lot to the north here. So I'm seeing a bit of this kind of Eno area to the north. I think I'll definitely have some Eno in there. That was one that somebody mentioned earlier. So the app again is called Native Land, and I'll put that in the chat. And if you just search Native Land in the App Store, I think, yeah, let's put some Eno on there. Eno looks really large. Let's see if we can have it around kind of like this. It sounds like it goes kind of around where Chapel Hill is. Label that. Eno. Oh, and that makes sense because here's the Eno River State Park. And it sounds like the Saponi is also around that area. And I'm going to go ahead and mark that right through, kind of right through here. That's the Haliwa Saponi. Beautiful. Let's see. Oh, there was one more. I know my friend in the chat mentioned, oh, we can't see anything in the chat. Let me go ahead and share it to all panelists and attendees. Thank you for letting me know. That is shakorihills.org, as well as nativeland.ca. The name of the app is also Native Land. One of my friends in the chat mentioned earlier one other nation. They mentioned Occaneechi. So I wanted to include Occaneechi as well. I guess I'll use blue. And that's kind of the very tip in here of that Falls Lake area. So I think I'm going to kind of give a general area around here. Beautiful. So this is a really interesting looking map. I see a lot of different lines that I might not have seen originally. And if I want to get more of a sense of not just the boundaries, but the breadth, how much land we're talking about, I could even color them in a little bit. So I could color this in. I could color in some of here for the Sapori. And I guess I would have to overlap them a little bit. The one thing I'll say about this app is I'm not completely sure, at least at first glance, if this is telling us that these are the territories of these different nations all at one time or at different points. So that's something that could be cool to explore. Something that I noticed when I was filling in these different territories is instead of using a lot of human-made landmarks, I was using a lot of the natural features on the land. And I was thinking we might be able to talk about that a little bit more. So I think that that's something. Oh, we have someone saying that they're acknowledging that they live on the Tuscarora land. That's awesome. That's really wonderful. Oh, thank you, Jamelia. That's a really great question. Jamelia was wondering if the museum has done any land back acknowledgements or initiatives. Not yet, but I am very interested in making some of that happen. I'm hoping that our program today can be kind of the first step to an initiative kind of like that. Thank you for bringing that up. I want to go back to my face cam really quickly here. Beautiful. So we've done some really beautiful kind of coloring on our map here. And we were talking a little bit about these different features on the land. And I know that while I'm kind of talking a little bit more about them, I'm going to be coloring in, especially some of these waterways, because I think that's going to be important. Because kind of the last thing I thought we might be able to do is talk a little bit about these different natural features, the land itself, and how that kind of changed how humans, especially the first peoples, were living on this land, and how that may affect us today. So what I know is in the area of North Carolina called the Piedmont, right, which is kind of that middle that extends all the way up pretty far the East Coast and extends a little bit down. It's this area with these rolling hills. It's got a lot of creeks. It's got a lot of lakes and ponds. Some of you even mentioned that you had a pond and a creek near your house. And because of the fact that kind of the northwest of our state is a little bit higher, the water tends to run from north to south a little bit. And that makes it kind of difficult to navigate. Like if we were trying to be on that river on a boat, it might be difficult to travel by boat in that area. But it does mean that these areas are really good at flooding. So over thousands of years, you have these different waterways that are flooding, and that makes for really fertile land that you might be able to grow things on. So when we are talking about we're thinking about history before European colonizers, it can be a little bit hard to learn about it. I mentioned earlier that a lot of the things that I learned were not the full story. So it's something that we're learning more about today, but something that's a little bit hard to find at first glance, maybe. The European colonizers, these settlers kind of sought to erase Indigenous history because they wanted to own the land that these Indigenous people already lived on. So they wanted to claim that the Indigenous people didn't have any historical right to the land, right? And especially kind of in this area that we're talking about in the Carolinas, Piedmont and the Carolinas, a lot of these Indigenous people were killed by European diseases as well as violence and forced relocation. So a lot of this original knowledge has been lost, though there are many efforts today to rediscover and preserve this history. Oh, thank you so much for Bethany is linking a lot of info about the Occaneechi at the Orange County History Museum site. This is so wonderful. I'm going to put this in the chat. Thank you for doing that. Right, because we're seeing, you know, this history is maybe a little bit harder to learn about, but it's not completely gone. We have a lot of it that we're learning more about. And something that I learned is that during the late Woodland period, which is about 800 to 1600 CE, so we're talking like thousands-ish of years ago, Indigenous people of North Carolina were doing a lot of farming in those really fertile areas we were talking about, especially toward the south of the Piedmont. Toward the north, you had a lot more hunter-gathering. So you have some pretty different cultures that are coming together. And I thought that that was really interesting. Something I learned from a very, very cool dissertation that I'm going to be sharing with you guys a little bit later is I learned about settlement patterns. So why people decided to live where they lived. And I learned that all of this farming in the area with all of these different waterways meant that you had some pretty complicated settlements going on, and these different settlements were trading a lot of different things. We mentioned earlier that the rivers were a little bit hard to navigate, so a lot of the trading had to be done by a footpath. And there is a particular path, sometimes called the Great Indian Trading Path, or the Great Trading Path, that was an Indigenous trading path that kind of went all the way, if I'm using my map here, it kind of came down all the way from Virginia and it went past Durham and Raleigh, oops, up here. No. It kind of went from Virginia down through in the Durham and Raleigh area, and then it went over toward kind of Charlotte. And that this was used by Indigenous people, later by colonists. It was made into a wagon road. And I learned that the Great Trading Path is kind of a big portion of where we think a lot of the interstate I-85 follows. So we think that what's now I-85, or at least part of it, was traveling around the same path as this 1,000-year-old Indigenous trading footpath. So this whole network of settlements is sometimes called the Piedmont Crescent. And it's the whole reason why the triangle is laid out the way it is today. Really quickly, I just wanted to share this with you. because I think it's a really cool image. If we're going here, we're seeing this kind of crescent shape right here. This is kind of that similar path that both the Great Trading Path and later on I-85 is following. And that's what's creating kind of the biggest population areas in the state of North Carolina. I'm gonna stop my share, come back here. So this whole Piedmont Crescent, which is kind of a center for trade and commerce and has the biggest modern cities in North Carolina, all comes from trading relationships and trading paths that are thousands and thousands of years old. So I guess what I always think about is a phrase, the past is always present. Indigenous people not only lived on this land first, Indigenous people created much of the modern world we live in today, right? And of course, Indigenous people are not just from the past. Indigenous people live here and now, today as well. There's so much amazing stuff to learn about, like specific trades and histories, different ways that the land shapes how people live on the land. We only had a really little bit of time today to scratch the surface on this rich past, present, and future. I hope that all of you might take our little exercise that we did today and maybe explore more regions. They could be outside of North Carolina, maybe in places you visited before, or where your friends or family might live. Explore whose land you inhabit. Explore whose land you travel on. And I think that leads us to finding ways to get involved in taking care of this land and the people who live on it, especially the first people to live on this land and who still live here, Indigenous people. So something I wanted to leave you with, and I'm also going to send a quick email to all of the registered emails after the program with these links. I wanted to link to some really great books by Indigenous people and about Indigenous history. These are for all ages, so they're pretty cool here. I wanted to go ahead and list this. Right there, beautiful. And we've had some people mentioning powwows, and I love you mentioning powwows, which is a great way to kind of share culturally. We have someone mentioning that there's an annual powwow at the Durham School of Math and Science every year in January and February, and I wonder if they'll go virtual. I know I've referred sometimes to powwows.com to find out what kind of powwows are in my area. There's also many Indigenous groups have social media that's for everyone to follow. So you could always check out what other resources they might have for future learning and especially about kind of current issues. And then one last resource I will send you some links for is the NC State Southeast Climate Adaptation Center, which has been working with tribal leaders and communities on climate resilience strategies. So I'm going to send a little bit more about that. It's really cool. We've actually had someone who was on our Climate Conscious NC program who also works with the Lumbee tribe, which is in kind of southerly North Carolina, on different kind of like water and resource management and all kinds of really cool stuff. I want to thank you all for coming here today and for learning a little bit more about the land that you live on and the Indigenous people who lived here first. If you'd like to show us your map, if you were able to do a map, please do post that on your social media and tag the museum because we want to see it and it could inspire someone else to learn more too. Yeah, thank you so much. I hope that this is a good, thank you very much. We've had someone saying that it's a good way to start this conversation with their family. And I really appreciate that. I hope that it's a good start to your conversation. I know it's a great way for me to get started too. I've learned so much. Thank you all and happy Indigenous Peoples Day. I will send a round of links via email a little bit later. Awesome. Thank you all so much. Thank you for being here, for acknowledging our land, and for getting started on your journey to learning more. Awesome. Thank you so much, friends. Really, really appreciate you all being here today. I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye. See you later, friends.